Hello everyone, and welcome. I hope this story gives you a chance to relax and unwind after a busy day. If you enjoy stories like this, please support the channel with a like, a share, and a subscription. Your support truly means a lot to me, and it gives me the motivation to keep growing this channel and bringing you more entertaining and enjoyable stories. Thank you so much for being here, and now, let's begin the story. At Concord Hall on Meridian Ring Station, Naomi Vale stood with both palms on the edge of a black glass table and looked out through the tall, curved wall. Beyond the station, cargo lines moved between distant beacons, rescue tenders crossed below in pairs, and long freight carriers slid through the light like dark bones in a wheel of steel. She was not there to admire the view. Naomi Vale was Earth's senior treaty delegate, sent to face the final hearing on the Transit Burden Accord before the full chamber of the Galaxy Council. Her job sounded simple when reduced to one sentence. She had come to stop Earth from being locked into a transit system that would make human ships pay more, wait longer, and ask permission to cross routes that should have stayed open to civilian travel and emergency rescue. The real danger was worse than the paper in front of her. Earth was the weaker side at Meridian Ring, and weaker sides were often defeated long before a vote if the room could be taught to see them as reckless. The Vera Compact controlled the major freight corridors outside the human cluster, and they did not need war to win. They needed patience, leverage, and a chamber full of species willing to call dependence by a cleaner name. If Naomi failed, Earth would lose more than money. Human carriers would be pushed out of independent lanes, and human rescue ships would need foreign clearance in sectors where a delay of minutes could cost lives. The door behind her slid open with a soft hiss. Elias Torr stepped in carrying a slate of revised schedules and a cup of bitter station coffee he knew she would not drink until it went cold. He was her policy aide, younger than Naomi by a decade, quiet by nature, and one of the few people on Meridian Ring she believed was not speaking. To her, with a hidden motive. They moved the opening sequence again, he said. Naomi turned. How far? They advanced procedural review. Public declarations come later now. Later by how much? Enough. That was how Meridian Ring worked. No shouted threats, no slammed tables, and no crude insults, only changes measured in minutes, clauses, seating order, and speaking sequence until an entire hearing leaned one way before the weaker side had even started. Naomi took the slate and scanned it. The order had changed exactly as Elias said, and the trap was clear. The chamber would now discuss whether Earth had behaved responsibly under the provisional transit rules before allowing Naomi to argue whether those rules had been fair in the first place. In plain terms, Earth would be judged before Earth was fully heard. If they frame us as unstable before the policy review, Elias said, then every objection sounds like proof. Naomi gave a small nod. Who signed off? The revision bears Concord Administrative Seal and Council Schedule Authority. And the co-certification? Elias hesitated for half a second. That was long enough. Say it, Naomi said. He lowered the slate. Earth Delegation Office. Naomi looked at him without moving. Local relay or central office? She asked. Central. The answer settled into the room like iron. The Earth Delegation Office was supposed to support her, not help Meridian Ring arrange her defeat. A notification flashed on Naomi's wrist display. She opened it at once. The sender was Lucan Reeve. Lucan Reeve headed the Strategic Liaison Bureau back on Earth, and while he was not her formal superior in chamber matters, he had enough reach to make careers bury reports and turn a dispute over method into an accusation of disloyalty. Naomi had worked around him for years. She had never trusted him. The message was one line. Do not force a public fracture. She read it once and let the display dim. Elias had seen enough of her face to understand. He knows the sequence changed. He knows more than that. Do you want me to request clarification from Earth? No. Naomi handed the slate back. If we ask the wrong question, they will answer the one they prepared for. Outside the chamber wall, the traffic lanes kept moving with machine calm. Nothing in that view hinted that an entire sector's future could be tilted inside a room filled with polite voices and soft carpet. Naomi straightened. Walk me through the line again. Simple. Out loud. Elias knew why she was asking. Before a public fight, Naomi always reduced the situation to its bones so no one could bury the truth under elegant language. He spoke carefully. The Vera Compact wants the Accord because it formalizes their priority control over external freight corridors. It raises operating burdens on independent carriers, especially Earth's, and wraps those burdens in safety language and coordination review. Naomi nodded once. And Earth? Officially, Earth wants equal transit access, fixed rescue exemptions, and review power over future route assessments. Officially, Naomi repeated. Elias did not smile. Unofficially, someone on Earth appears willing to accept a bad accord if it buys a stable relationship with the Compact and creates room for private subcontracting after ratification. Which means if I fail the right way, some people still win. Yes. Naomi moved to the side console and opened the chamber map. Concord Hall sat at the center of Meridian Ring's diplomatic crown, an arena built for visibility and pressure. Tiered galleries rose around the speaking floor. Delegates faced one another across open space while translation arcs glowed above them in pale light. There were no deep shadows in that place. It had been designed to make secrecy difficult and pressure unavoidable. Good, Naomi thought. Then pressure could work both ways. A few minutes later, station guides came for them. Naomi left the waiting room with one clear goal: reach Concord Hall before the hearing settled into a version of the truth she could no longer move. The walk to the chamber took them through a corridor lined with the emblems of signatory blocks. Earth's mark was there, smaller than some, newer than most, a blue-white ring around a dark curve with no attempt to hide how late humanity had arrived to the wider order. Naomi had seen it in 100 meeting zones. It had never bothered her that Earth's symbol looked young. What bothered her was how often other powers mistook young for pliable. At the final security arch, an administrative officer in silver gray paused over Naomi's credentials for a fraction longer than protocol required. Delegate Vale, the officer said, "You understand that today's review includes provisional compliance evaluation." "I read the amended schedule," Naomi replied. The officer inclined his head. "Then you understand the Chamber's concern." Naomi met his eyes. "I understand the Chamber's habit." He had no answer for that. He handed her clearance marker back without expression. Concord Hall opened before them in widening circles of light and disciplined noise. Translators whispered in overlapping tones, gallery observers shifted in their seats, and assistants moved in straight lines along the outer rail. The Vera delegation had already taken position. Naomi recognized Minister Kalis for at once. He stood near the Compact's table, speaking to a cluster of allied observers, tall and spare, with the stillness of a man who had spent a lifetime learning how to insult people without raising his voice. Kalis was the Compact's chief negotiating minister for external transport frameworks. He had a talent shared by certain patient predators, making coercion sound like an offer made for your own good. As Naomi entered, Kalis turned with perfect timing, as if he had been waiting for the sight line. "Delegate Vale," he said, stepping forward just far enough to seem gracious. "I'm glad Earth chose continuity after all." Naomi stopped a polite distance from him. Continuity is useful when the terms remain visible. A faint murmur moved through the nearest observer row. Kalis gave her the kind of smile that had all the right proportions and no warmth at all. "Visibility is exactly what Concord Hall provides. Then we should both be comfortable today. That depends on what each of us prefers to keep in view." Elias shifted half a step behind Naomi. She knew he had heard the message beneath the message. Kalis wanted her to understand that the room had already been prepared. Naomi did not take the bait. "My government sent me to discuss routes, burdens, and rights," she said. "I assume your side came for the same reason." Kalis spread two fingers in a gesture halfway between agreement and correction. "We came for stability. The routes will follow." Stability, another clean word, and another word that often meant someone else would carry the cost. Before Naomi could answer, a chamber tone sounded overhead. The hall dimmed by a degree, and delegates moved to their assigned places. At the central dais, Chair Selmar took the high seat. Mara represented no single species block at the table, which was his official strength and his true danger. He presided over process with such smooth neutrality that outcomes could be shaped through sequence alone, while his tone remained almost gentle. Naomi had studied his history before coming to Meridian Ring, and he had never once let a structurally important hearing drift by accident. Delegates, Mars said, and the translation mesh carried his words through the hall in soft, layered resonance. We assemble for the concluding review of the Transit Burden Accord and its associated compliance instruments. There was already. The room was being told what this day was about before Naomi had spoken a word. Mar continued. The purpose of this session is to clarify whether participating parties have acted in sufficient good faith under provisional corridor management to justify final burden allocation and authority layering under the accord. Naomi stood at Earth's table with both hands lightly resting before her. She kept her face neutral, but her mind marked the shift with cold precision. They were not beginning with rights. They were beginning with whether Earth deserved rights. Mars' gaze moved toward her. Delegate Vale. The chamber recognizes Earth's presence and notes the substitution of direct ministerial representation with treaty delegation authority. A few heads turned. The phrasing was neutral on paper, but in the room it reminded everyone that Earth had not sent a cabinet figure or executive head. Naomi was not there as a head of state. She was there as a negotiator, which made it easier for the galleries to imagine she might be overruled if things turned badly enough. Naomi gave the formal acknowledgement. Earth stands present, she said, with full authority to address transit burdens, rescue exemptions, route access, and procedural fairness under review. She added the last phrase on purpose. Mars' expression did not change. Duly noted. Then the first real blow fell. Before opening declarations, Mars said, the Chamber will review an amended certification order regarding provisional compliance incidents raised by the Compact and corroborated through administrative exchange. Naomi felt Elias go still beside her. Administrative exchange was the elegant public version of saying someone had helped them from inside Earth. A display arc bloomed over the chamber floor. Incidents appeared in sequence, delayed route acknowledgments, unscheduled human carrier movements, and emergency lane entries contested after the fact. None of the items were invented. That made them dangerous. The lie was not in the events themselves. It was in the framing. Every case had context. A relief convoy had entered a disputed lane because a station failure had left civilians without atmospheric stabilizers. An Earth rescue cutter had crossed unapproved corridor space because waiting for compact clearance would have left a damaged transport drifting beyond recovery, and a carrier had rerouted around collapsed beacons in a lane the compact later claimed had never been opened for alternate use. Each item was shown without the pressure that caused it. That was how a system buried truth without touching falsehood directly. Kayla stood when his turn came. The Compact does not question Earth capacity for effort, he said. We question whether effort without discipline can be integrated safely into a corridor network shared by billions. The phrase was built for galleries. It was not crude enough to provoke sympathy, just sharp enough to lodge in memory. He went on. No party benefit from instability disguised as urgency. No rescue principle can survive if every actor reserves the right to define emergency for itself. Naomi listened, and while she listened, she understood the setup more clearly. This was not simply about passing a bad accord. It was about passing it under a moral story that would make resistance look selfish. If Earth opposed the framework now, it would not be opposing burdens but order, safety, and common trust. When Mar turned toward her table at last, Naomi was already ready. Delegate Vale, he said. The chamber will hear Earth's response to the provisional incidents before proceeding. Naomi rose. This was the moment many negotiators ruined by trying to answer everything at once. They dumped context in piles and argued details before securing the frame. Naomi did none of that. She looked around the chamber, not theatrically, just enough to acknowledge the scale of the audience. Then she began in the calm voice she used when a fight required the sharpest edge. Earth is here for one reason, she said. To keep civilian transit open, rescue access real, and future corridor rules from being written in a way that punishes the weaker side for surviving under strain. The chamber quieted further. The incidents displayed by the compact are not fiction. They are fragments. If the chamber wants to judge Earth fairly, it should hear not only what human ships did, but what conditions forced those choices and why the provisional rules often left no lawful path that could save lives and time. A faint movement came from Kalis's table. Not alarm, but calculation. Naomi continued. Earth will answer every case placed before this hall, but before I do, the record should note that the session order was amended after my delegation received the prior certification sequence. The chamber is therefore evaluating Earth under a revised frame that Earth did not approve in advance. There it was. Not an accusation yet, only a record. Mar folded his hands. The amendment entered through valid channels. Then let the record show that as well, Naomi said. The source of that validity may become relevant. For the first time, a true current moved through the room. Not outrage and not drama, but attention. Naomi saw Saelis glance toward Mar, just once. Good, she thought. Let them know I can see the machinery. Mar's voice remained smooth. The record will reflect the delegate's concern. Concern. Another soft word. Naomi accepted it for the moment. She was not yet ready to demand a harder one. The chamber moved forward, but something had changed. The hearing was still structured against Earth. The sequence still hurt, and the burden still sat on Naomi's shoulders like iron. Yet, by forcing the alteration into public record, she had planted the first anchor. By the time the first procedural block closed, she knew one thing for certain. This had not become an unfair hearing through drift, haste, or ordinary bias. Too many small pieces aligned too cleanly. Someone wanted Earth to lose. Someone wanted Naomi Vale to lose in a way the chamber could call reasonable. And somewhere beyond Meridian Ring, someone on Earth had agreed to help. When Concord Hall broke for recess, Naomi and Elias left the hearing floor and moved off the main corridor to a side room behind the lower delegation tier. They had gone there for one immediate purpose: find out how the frame had been built before the chamber returned. Naomi stood over a narrow projection table while Elias broke down the public record line by line. The galleries outside were still buzzing, and analysts were already shaping the first summaries that would spread across diplomatic channels by station dusk. Most of those summaries would repeat the chamber's mood. Earth under scrutiny, compact sites pattern of instability, final transit review uncertain. That phrasing alone could do damage before any vote was cast. Elias expanded the meeting trace on the table. He had pulled every public timestamp, seal change, and sequence revision from the station mirror. The amendment hit the central docket 6 hours before opening, he said. I know, but Earth's prior copy remained unchanged until less than 2 hours before the session. Naomi watched the highlighted lines move under his hand. Meaning the chamber had time to prepare around the new order before our formal copy reflected it. So they moved first and told us second. Yes. Can we prove intent? Not from public logs. Naomi looked at the trace again. Intent was never where systems placed it. Intent lived in the gaps between permissible actions, and who benefited from delay, who received clean copies early, and whose objections expired before their turn to speak. Show me the authority chain, she said. Elias magnified the seal trail. Council Scheduling Division, Concord Administrative Attestation, Delegation Office Co-Certification. There was again. Earth. Naomi leaned closer. Which office key? The Delegation Office Authority tree masks the personal signer in the public version. Masking on what basis? Routine administrative privacy. Naomi let out a breath through her nose. Routine privacy. Of course. She stepped away from the table, then back again. Meridian Ring rooms were built to lower the pulse, with neutral walls, muted light, and no clutter. It only made the knowledge inside them feel colder. What do we know about the incident list? She asked. Elias swiped and brought up the hearing items. Every incident is real, and every incident is also useful to the compact in exactly this frame, which is why they chose them. He nodded. 3 involved rescue corridor entries. 2 involved rerouted civilian carriers. One involved an unregistered external tow operation. Each could be described as instability if you strip out the cause. Naomi looked at the rescue entries. Those bothered her most, not because they were hardest to defend, but because Kalis had used them to occupy moral ground. A system that delayed rescue and then accused the rescuer of disorder had already declared what sort of order it believed in. "Pull me the original distress windows," she said. They were buried under traffic review. "Pull them anyway." Elias worked. Naomi waited. When he brought the distress windows up, the pattern sharpened. Each human intervention had happened under compressed time conditions: equipment failure, beacon collapse, decompression cascade, and thermal loss in an unheated transport segment. None of them had left a comfortable margin for permission. Kalis knew that, and more likely knew it too. The point was not that Earth had acted irrationally. The point was that Earth had acted without waiting for higher approval, which made it easier to describe human judgment as dangerous. A tone flicked from Naomi's display. "Incoming secure relay. Lucan Reeve." Naomi stared at the signal for 2 seconds before accepting. Lucan appeared as a clean image against a dark office backdrop on Earth. Even through compressed transmission, he looked assembled rather than present. That was his talent, always giving the impression that he had edited himself before entering a room. "Naomi," he said, as if they had been in mid-conversation all along. "You made your point." "What point was that?" "That Earth will not be spoken over easily." "It was effective. Do not make more of it than needed." Naomi said nothing. Lucan folded his hands. "The chamber is volatile. Meridian will punish any sign that Earth intends to turn a procedural dispute into a legitimacy dispute." "I did not turn it into one," Naomi said. Someone else amended the hearing frame and attached Earth's seal to the revision. Lucan's face did not change. "Then note the irregularity and preserve your main objective." "My main objective is not to pretend I did not see what happened." "Your main objective is to secure a survivable accord." There was again. Survivable, another strategic word for a measured loss someone had already accepted. Naomi kept her tone even. "Did you authorize the co-certification?" "I'm not discussing internal sequencing over a live relay. This channel is sealed. No channel at Meridian Ring is sealed in the way people say it is." He leaned slightly closer, his voice softening. "Listen to me carefully. If you force a public break, the chamber will not rally to Earth. They will close ranks. You will give Kalis exactly what he wants." Naomi heard the message beneath the warning. "Do not force a public break" meant do not break the frame. "Then what do you want?" she asked. "A controlled outcome." "Define controlled." "A revised burden structure. Some concession on rescue lanes. A path to corridor normalization over time." "In exchange for what?" Lucan paused. Only for a beat, but Naomi saw it. "In exchange," he said, "for not treating today as a stage on." Which to prove a larger philosophical point. Something settled into place inside her. He was not denying the trap, only asking her to step into it gracefully. "You sent me to defend Earth," she said. "I sent you to protect Earth from the cost of pride." Naomi's gaze sharpened. "No, you sent me to lose without noise." Lucan's expression remained composed, but the polish cracked by a hair. "You are tired," he said. "Take the recess. Answer the chamber with restraint. Do not make this personal." Then the relay cut. Elias had not heard the full exchange, but he had heard enough for Naomi's side. "He wants you to fold inside the frame. He wants me to bless the frame." Naomi dismissed the dead relay window. Her pulse was steady. That was what anger looked like in her, not heat but alignment. "Then we stop guessing," she said. "We find the signer." They spent the next hour chasing what Meridian Ring wanted hidden behind routine opacity. To move the search forward, Naomi requested a technical briefing from the chamber's independent process auditor. Not a complaint and not a formal protest, just a briefing. That distinction mattered. Formal protests trigger defenses, while briefings trigger habits. Systems liked explaining themselves when they believed the explanation would reinforce obedience. Auditor Turin Quill met them in a narrow archive alcove overlooking one of the lower relay shafts. Naomi had moved there with Elias for one reason: to learn exactly how the hearing change had been made and what kind of proof could break it open. Quill was older than Naomi, though not frail. His manner was careful, his voice lower than expected, and his expression permanently tilted toward patient disbelief, as if half the station spent its time making avoidable mistakes in front of him. "Delegate Vale," he said, "I understand you want clarification on session amendments." "Clarification on how the approval path works," Naomi corrected. Quill gave the faintest sign that he appreciated the difference. He brought up a skeletal version of the authority tree. It was not enough to identify the private signer, but enough to show how the route had been approved. Council procedural desk, Concord scheduling desk, external delegation co-certification, and a private authority token applied through Earth Delegation Office. Naomi asked the question that mattered. Does the validity of a session amendment depend on the private token holder having real authority over the represented party's speaking interest? Quill answered without embellishment. Not in a strong sense. It depends on whether the delegation office recognizes the token as properly empowered for administrative channeling. Administrative channeling, Naomi said. Yes. Even if the practical effect is to alter the represented party's ability to defend itself in chamber. Quill looked at her steadily. You asked for a validity explanation, not a moral defense. A faint sound came from Elias that might have been the beginning of a bitter laugh. Naomi silenced him with a small motion. So the system allows material harm under procedural sufficiency, she said. Quill considered that. The system allows a broad range of administrative action when formal seals align. Why? Because the council prefers continuity over disputes about delegated intent. Naomi let that answer sit in the air. There was again continuity, stability, and administrative sufficiency. The galaxy had found many clean words for allowing stronger structures to feed on weaker ones without ever sounding crude. Can the private token be unmasked? She asked. Not through public request. Can it be reviewed by audit? Yes. Under what condition? Evidence of material misrepresentation. Naomi held his gaze. And what would count? Quill was silent for a moment. Then he said, that depends on whether one is auditing error, abuse, or design. It was the most honest sentence anyone on Meridian Ring had given her all day. Naomi saw then that Turin Quill was not an ally. Not yet. But he was a man who knew where the bones were buried under the polished floor. In rooms like this, that was often more useful. Thank you, she said. Quill inclined his head. I have clarified the path. I have not taken a side. I noticed. As they turned to leave, Quill added one sentence. Delegate Vale. If your problem is only with the amendment, you may lose quietly. If your problem is with the interaction between the amendment and the narrative built around it, then the threshold is higher. Naomi stopped. Higher how? You need to show not only that the path was used, but what outcome it was used to make plausible. Then he walked away. Back in the side room, Elias looked at her across the projection table. He just told you the chamber will ignore a technical error and react only if the error is tied to a shaped public outcome. Yes, that is a terrible system. Naomi stared at the incident list still hanging over the table. It is an excellent system, she said quietly, for the people who built it. The recess ended sooner than she wanted, and they had to leave the side room and return to Concord Hall before the next block began. By the time they stepped back into the chamber, curiosity had sharpened into appetite. The room sensed friction. It wanted to know whether Earth would still fight inside the provided terms or do something more dangerous. Silas Vore began the next block with studied restraint. The compact acknowledges Earth's request for full contextual review, he said. We therefore submit this supplementary assessment on lane behavior under stress. The display changed. This was new, a clean set of predictive models showing how independent rescue calls could, if generalized across multiple powers, produce cascading lane instability. On their face, the models were not absurd. Under enough actors and enough strain, anything could be made to look dangerous. But the timing was sharp. He was not just answering Naomi's earlier point. He was moving first in the moral space she had tried to reopen. If rescue becomes self-defined, order dies. That was the argument. It would play well. Naomi listened as he laid out the theory. She could have jumped in with specifics, raised actual distress windows, and challenged the assumptions in the model. But the numbers were not the real battle yet. The real battle was still the frame. Kayla's finished by turning toward her table. No system can survive, he said, if every party invokes human urgency as exemption from shared procedure. Human urgency. He had chosen a phrase carefully. Not urgency, but human urgency, a species trait made suspect. Mar looked to Naomi. Earth may respond. Naomi stood. She had only seconds to choose. She could strike at the model and lose the larger pattern, or she could do something harder. She chose silence first. Not total silence, but strategic silence. She let the room feel the pause. Then she spoke. Minister Vore is right about one thing, she said. No corridor system can survive if every actor declares emergency whenever it wants advantage. Kalis did not move, but she saw a tension narrow in his eyes. That is why Earth has not asked this chamber for sentimental exemption. Naomi continued. Earth has asked for a rescue, standard tied to measurable danger and reviewable urgency, because the current framework punishes action first and studies causes later. She let that settle, then added, the minister's model assumes abuse if judgment exists below centralized permission. The chamber should ask why that assumption appears most often when human crews act to keep civilians alive in time windows the current burden rules were never built to handle. Again, she did not over-explain. Again, she refused the temptation to dump proof before it would matter. Kalis replied at once. Then Earth should welcome formalized oversight instead of resisting it. Naomi met him with steady calm. Oversight is not the same as dependence. And dependence is not the same as peace. That line stayed in the chamber after she sat down. She felt it in the gallery's shift, in a muted relay noise along the outer arc, and in the way Mar delayed half a heartbeat before proceeding. It was not enough to change the day, but it was enough to keep Earth from shrinking inside someone else's language. When a second recess came, Naomi and Elias left Concord Hall again, this time by a maintenance lift to a lower record span rarely used by public delegations. They went there with a new goal, stop arguing only about process, and find out who would benefit if Earth lost. It was there, far from gallery noise, that Elias delivered the first real break. He had followed, not the hearing sequence, but a chain of post-ratification contracting notices filed under civilian logistics review. The notices were not active yet. They were contingency drafts hidden under generic labels. On their own, they were harmless. Together, they were not. If the accord passes in current form, Elias said, bringing the drafts up one by one, priority civilian relief contracts in 3 outer sectors moved to subcontracted carriers certified under compact review. Which means? Naomi asked. Earth rescue and relief operations lose default standing. Human operators become applicants. Naomi felt the chill of it more than the anger. Not because it was surprising, but because of how complete the design was. You burden human transit, describe human improvisation as unstable, then reassign human rescue authority to networks friendly to the block that created the burden. Control without conquest and compliance without open defeat. Elegant. Who holds the subcontracting shells? She asked. Elias opened the ownership web. The names meant nothing at first, and that was the point. Outer shelf carriers, corridor reliability trusts, and intersector insurance syndicates, all structured to look boring. Then he peeled one layer deeper. A private strategic holding linked through 2 Earth-based consultancies to Lucan Reeves' liaison network. Naomi stared at the web. There it is, Elias said. Yes. He sold the speaking frame to help create the need. Then he positioned his people to profit from the cure. Naomi's face remained still, but her thoughts sharpened to painful clarity. The chamber framing, the rescue narrative, the controlled outcome, and the warning not to force a public break all aligned. They did not just want Naomi to lose. They wanted Earth to lose in a way that would turn future human dependence into a managed market. She looked at the station time. The final blocks were closing fast. They still lacked one bridge between the contract network and the hearing manipulation. Without that bridge, Lucan could claim coincidence future planning, or routine contingency practice? We need the token, she said. Elias exhaled. Quill said private signer identity requires material misrepresentation review. Then we give a material misrepresentation. We do not have the path yet. Naomi looked up through the thin floor grating toward the muted hum of Concord Hall above. In a few hours, the chamber would either lock Earth into a future designed by others or be forced to admit that its own fairness had become part of the scheme. She was no longer trying merely to secure better clauses. She was trying to keep Earth from being fitted politely and permanently for a collar. Find Quill, she said. They found him not in audit, but in transit between divisions, carrying a narrow case, and speaking with 2 process clerks near a data well. Naomi intercepted him with no preamble. I need 5 minutes, she said. He took one look at her face and dismissed the clerks without protest. Elias projected the contingency contracts against the well's inner field. Quill read in silence. Naomi watched his eyes rather than the data. Trained people lied with their mouths. Their eyes lied only when they practiced in front of mirrors. When Quill reached the ownership link to Lucan's network, something changed. This is not chamber evidence, he said. No, Naomi Vale. It is motive. Motive is not. My office. No. But if a chamber amendment reduced Earth's ability to answer, and that reduction helped produce a ratification path that benefits the network of the same Earth authority group that approved the amendment, then we are no longer discussing neutral administrative sequence. Quill said nothing. Naomi stepped closer, careful not to crowd him. I am not asking you to choose Earth. I am asking you to decide whether your system is comfortable being used this openly. A long second passed. Then Quill said, there is one place the token trail may still exist in raw form. Elias answered before Naomi could. Where? In the speech rights buffer logs. They are not part of the public hearing record. They are compression residue before formal archive. Can they be accessed? By audit and continuity review. Which one are you using? Naomi asked. Quill looked at her. That depends on what I find. The buffer logs were housed in an old relay chamber beneath the main hall, and Naomi, Elias, and Quill moved there at once. They were going after the last missing piece, proof of how Earth had been weakened before it was judged. Few delegates even knew the chamber existed, and fewer still understood that speaking rights in Concord Hall did not flow directly from assigned seats. They passed through a priority mesh that balanced sequence, recognition, translation load, and chamber order. Change that mesh at the right moment, and a party might still speak, but not enough, not soon enough, or not while the room still cared. Quill opened the buffer vault with layered authorization and brought up the raw logs. There it was. Earth's speaking priority had not merely been adjusted. It had been reduced in anticipation of the compliance first sequence. The authorization stack showed 2 keys, Council Scheduling Authority and Earth Delegation Office Private Token. Quill turned one field and the mask fell. Not Lucan's name in simple public text, but a private credential path linked to his bureau's authority spine and resolved by one internal identity signature. It was clean enough for audit and damning enough for anyone who understood what they were seeing. Elias let out a breath that sounded almost like pain. Naomi did not move. We have it, he said. No, Quill said. You have part of it. Naomi looked at him. The chamber can still bury this, he continued. It can suspend proceedings, move to internal review, and treat the hearing as contaminated while preserving the burden structure in temporary force. If that happens, you may expose the abuse and still lose the practical field. He was right. This was Meridian Ring. Proof alone did not guarantee effect. Proof had to be introduced in a way the chamber could not swallow whole and digest in private. How do we stop that? Naomi asked. Quill closed the raw log, then opened it again as if to confirm it still existed. You must make the procedural abuse inseparable from the public argument built on top of it, he said. If the room sees this only as internal misconduct, it will wash its hands and keep the policy. If the room sees that the misconduct shaped the moral case against Earth, it will be harder to preserve the accord without owning the stain. Naomi thought of Kalis's phrases, human urgency, stability, discipline, and no system can survive. She understood now what had to happen. The chamber could survive one exposed manipulation. Systems survive those all the time. What could not survive easily was having its fairness exposed at the exact moment one of its key ministers stood publicly chained to a moral argument that relied on that manipulation. Naomi looked at Quill. "Will you verify the raw log if I force it into the room?" He hesitated. "Will you?" "Yes," he said at last. "If it is the log you claim." That was enough. The final day block began under sharper light, and Naomi returned from the relay chamber to Concord Hall knowing exactly what she had to do. The room had shifted from interest to expectancy. Rumors were already moving. Naomi could feel it in the way gallery observers leaned forward before translations even completed, and in the way allied tables whispered less and watched more. Luke and Reeve had not appeared in person, but a remote advisory channel had been opened on Earth's delegation line. Naomi saw the indicator at her table. He was listening now. Good. Mar called the chamber back to order. Before the scheduled burden vote, Naomi requested a procedural interjection. Kalis objected at once. Earth has been heard repeatedly. The chamber should not allow delay through manufactured uncertainty. Naomi rose slowly, eyes on Mar rather than Kalis. Earth requests only confirmation that the hearing record reflecting Earth's speaking. Authority and amendment pathway is complete and materially intact. A minor request. Almost boring. That was the power of it. Mar studied her. On what ground? On the ground that the chamber has judged Earth's conduct under a sequence Earth did not substantively approve, and that sequence altered the conditions under which Earth could answer the allegations used to support the present burden structure. A murmur swept the lower tiers. Not because the point was new, but because she had now tied sequence, answerability, and burden structure into one clean line. Kalis leaned forward. "This is theater." Naomi turned just enough to acknowledge him. "No, Minister. Theater would have required less paperwork." A few quiet sounds came from the gallery. Not laughter exactly, but recognition. Mar held up one hand, and the room settled. "The chamber will hear the basis in brief." Naomi had planned those minutes in her head a dozen times before coming back upstairs. She would not waste them. "The basis is simple," she said. "The compact asked this hall to judge Earth's reliability before hearing Earth's full case on why the provisional rules repeatedly created rescue and civilian traffic failures. That judgment was made possible by a hearing amendment and a reduction in Earth's speech priority. Earth now has reason to believe those changes were not neutral." Mar's eyes narrowed by a fraction. "Reason is not proof." "Correct," Naomi said, "which is why I asked the chamber's process auditor to verify the raw speech buffer log in this room, now, before any vote on burden allocation proceeds." This time the stir in the chamber reached the upper rows. Kalis rose. "The minister objects. Raw audit materials are not instruments for public spectacle." Naomi faced him fully for the first time that day. And yet public judgment has already been made from a frame those materials may prove compromised. Kalis answered with sharpened courtesy. "The delegate is attempting to rescue a failing position by attacking administration." Naomi did not blink. "No, I am trying to determine whether administration was used to create the failing position." That landed harder than the earlier lines. She felt it ripple across the hall. Cause and effect had just reversed in public view. Mar called for Auditor Quill. Quill stepped forward from a side audit rail with the measured reluctance of a man who had no interest in becoming memorable. Naomi respected him more for that. "Can the raw log be verified in chamber?" Mar asked. Quill answered without ornament. "Yes." "Can it be summarized rather than displayed?" Quill looked briefly toward Naomi, then back to Mar. "Not if the question concerns whether the hearing frame and speaking priority interacted materially. Summary would force interpretation before inspection." Mar knew then that the room was slipping beyond soft containment. Naomi saw it in the complete stillness of his posture. "So be it," he said. The display arc above the chamber shifted. Quill loaded the log. He did not dramatize it. He let the fields appear one by one. Speech priority assignment, revision timestamp, amendment relation tag, co-certification chain, and then the dual authority path linking the procedural change to Council scheduling and Earth delegation office. It took the room several long seconds to understand what it was seeing. Most in the gallery did not read audit structure by profession. But understanding came in stages, and Naomi had prepared for that too. She spoke before anyone else could shape it. For the chamber, this log shows that Earth's chance to answer was reduced through the same administrative path that enabled today's compliance-first sequence. The path did not arise solely from Council process. It required validation from Earth Delegation Authority. Now the room had plain language. Mar's face remained neutral, but his voice came slower. Auditor, is the displayed log genuine? It is. Does it support the delegate's characterization? It supports the claim that speaking priority and hearing sequence were materially linked through a dual authorization path. Kalis moved at once, fast. He had seen the danger too. Then the issue is regrettable, he said, but discreet. If an internal Earth authority assisted in a procedural adjustment, that speaks to Earth's own coordination weakness, not to the underlying necessity of the accord. There it was, the containment move. Admit a limited abuse and save the policy. Naomi had been waiting for exactly that. She turned toward him, her voice calm enough to force the whole hall quiet. Minister Vore, before this session, you argued that Earth's actions under strain proved a pattern of instability and insufficient discipline. I did. You argued that decentralized human judgment in rescue and lane response threatened shared order. Yes. You argued that the chamber must therefore support a burden structure that places Earth under tighter transit discipline. The chamber heard me clearly. Good, Naomi said. Then let it hear you clearly once more. Do you maintain that the case against Earth was presented under conditions fair enough to justify those conclusions? Kalis hesitated. It was small and barely visible, but in a chamber trained to read power, hesitation was speech. He had two choices, and neither was good. If he said yes, he tied himself to a process now visibly altered in ways that weakened Earth's answer. If he said no, he undercut his own day's argument and the urgency of the burden structure he wanted passed. He chose the line experienced men choose when both roads hurt. The chamber's broader concerns remain valid, he said, even if one procedural route requires review. Naomi took one step forward. No, she said, that is not an answer. You used a shaped hearing to give moral weight to a conclusion that burdens Earth for choices made under pressure. If the hearing was shaped, then the weight was shaped too. The galleries were no longer quiet in the polite way. They were quiet in the dangerous way, the way crowds become when a story they were prepared to accept starts tearing in the middle. Naomi continued before the silence could break. The question is not whether the compact prefers a tighter corridor system. Of course it does. The question is whether Earth was pushed into a speaking disadvantage so the chamber could first hear discipline without context, instability without cause, and rescue without the lives at risk. She turned now not to Kalis, but to the chamber itself. Because if that is what happened, then the issue before us is larger than one bad amendment. It is whether weaker parties may be burdened, judged, and then called unreasonable when they resist the terms created by their own silencing. No one moved. Not Mar, not Kalis, and not the observers with hand slates hovering over paused notes. Naomi felt the room lock around the idea, and she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Exposing the mechanism was not the final strike. The final strike was motive. She opened the contract trace. Elias pushed the file live from Earth's table. This, Naomi said, is why the chamber cannot treat the abuse as isolated. If the accord passes in present form, relief and civilian transit priority in key outer sectors move to subcontracted carriers aligned, through networks connected to the same Earth Authority cluster that helped alter this hearing. The ownership web spread in bright threads above the hall. Not everyone understood the finance at once. Naomi did not let confusion grow. In plain terms, she said, Earth's disadvantage here was not merely useful to the compact. It was profitable to a group on Earth positioned to benefit if human independent transit rights were weakened and replaced by managed dependence. That did it. Shock did not hit Concord Hall like noise. It hit like absence, as if the room had forgotten how to breathe for a second and had to remember together. Mar spoke first, but even he sounded more human now. Is the chamber to understand that Earth's own administrative authority aided a hearing structure that could produce commercial advantage for a linked network after ratification? Naomi answered without triumph. There was no room for triumph in this, only clarity. Yes. Can this be substantiated beyond assertion? Quill, to Naomi's surprise, stepped in before she could. The ownership network does not fall under my office, he said, but the linkage between the hearing adjustment and Earth Authority path is substantiated. If the delegate's contract materials are authentic, then the concern is not hypothetical. Mar looked to Kalis. Minister for. Kalis had lost the ease from his shoulders. He still looked controlled and dignified, but the confidence that had carried him through the earlier blocks was gone. For the first time, he was not speaking from height. He was speaking from damage control. The compact does not manage internal Earth profiteering, he said. Naomi answered at once. No, but the compact did benefit from the frame it helped create, and it argued for a burden structure using conclusions drawn inside that frame. You do not have to control every corrupt hand to use what it delivers. The line struck harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as it needed to. The remote advisory channel at Naomi's table lit bright. Lucan Reeve was requesting live address. Mar, trapped now by the need for openness, could hardly refuse without making matters worse. He authorized the relay. Lucan appeared above the lower chamber in pale projection, immaculate as ever, though now the polish looked less like authority and more like armor. He began with the tone of a man trying to salvage reason from chaos. The Earth delegation regrets procedural confusion. Any implication that strategic stabilization efforts were equivalent to betrayal of human interests is deeply irresponsible. Naomi turned toward the projection. She had imagined this moment with anger, but anger was not what she felt. What she felt was exhaustion stripped down to purpose. You may clarify, Director Reeve, Mar said. Lucan inclined his head with practiced gravity. Earth has been trying to avoid a destructive rupture with the compact for years. Many of us judged that controlled compromise was preferable to symbolic confrontation. Administrative adjustments may have been made with that broader objective in mind. If mistakes occurred, they occurred in pursuit of stability. Controlled compromise, administrative adjustments, mistakes. He was trying to cool the shape of the crime by changing its temperature. Naomi asked the question before he could build more language around himself. If Earth never consented to having its speaking position materially reduced in a compliance-first hearing, she said, why did your office authorize the token that enabled the reduction? Lucan looked at her with an expression almost gentle. You are simplifying a complex sequence. No, Naomi said. I am clarifying it. A current moved through the room. Lucan tried another angle. Delegate Vale, you were instructed to preserve a workable path. I was instructed, Naomi said, to represent Earth. And representation includes trade-offs. Not this one. History may judge otherwise. Naomi took one step closer to the field that held his face. History can judge later. The chamber is judging now. So, answer plainly. Did your office authorize the token knowing it would cut Earth's speaking priority before the chamber heard Earth's full defense? The stillness that followed felt endless. Lucan could not say yes, and he could not say no. If he lied, the log stood against him. If he admitted the truth, he burned himself and anyone still trying to preserve the session as honest. He did what trapped officials always do at the edge. He reached for intent. My office authorized sequence control to prevent escalation, he said. There it was. Not the clean admission, but enough. More than enough. Naomi heard the chamber change around her. She heard it in the gallery's intake of breath, in the shuffle along allied tables, and in the way even Kalis no longer looked at Lucan as a partner, but as a liability who had spoken one sentence too far. Sequence control to prevent escalation. He had said it himself. Not to improve clarity, not to correct an error, and not to satisfy routine administration. to control sequence, to control who spoke, when, and to control how Earth would be heard before it was judged. Mars' voice came down with a firmness that had been absent earlier. The scheduled burden vote is suspended. No one objected quickly enough to matter. The chamber, Mar continued, will not proceed under unresolved evidence of coordinated hearing distortion involving represented party suppression and linked strategic benefit. Kalis rose, but his objection came late and thin. The compact rejects the implication that necessary burden stabilization is invalid because of Earth's internal misconduct. Naomi turned toward him one final time. The compact may still argue for tighter corridors. It may still argue for oversight, standards, and burden layering. But it may not do so on the back of a hearing shaped to weaken Earth's voice and then ask the chamber to call the result neutral. Kalis opened his mouth, then closed it. Naomi saw then that he understood the deeper loss. The day's policy might be revived later, in altered form, under different pressure. Power rarely vanished because of one exposure. But the clean story he had carried into the room was gone. The chamber would not forget that its moral case against Earth had been staged on a tilted floor. In politics, a damaged story can bleed for years. What followed was not glorious. Real victories rarely are. There were motions, emergency review calls, corridor continuity provisions, alliance consultations, 3 attempts by secondary blocks to limit the scope of the suspension, and 2 efforts by compact allies to isolate Lucan's office from the policy argument and save parts of the accord anyway. Naomi fought each one with the same weapon she had used all day. Clarity. Not every clause and not every theory, only the central fact. A burden structure built through a hearing that weakened Earth's answer was not legitimate. By the time the chamber rose, the transit burden accord in its current form was dead. Not permanently, perhaps, and not in all futures. But it was dead for that day, in that room, and for the version of the galaxy that had expected Earth to bow neatly and sign. After the suspension, Naomi stepped away from the chamber floor and out toward the outer glass wall while the room dissolved into damage control. The break after the suspension felt stranger than the hearing itself. People approached her with respectful distance, some out of real regard, some out of calculation, and some because staying near a surviving story is a form of self-protection in political places. She accepted almost none of it. Elias found her at the wall where the cargo lines moved beyond Meridian Ring like distant threads under hard light. "We stopped the vote," he said. "We stopped this vote." That is more than anyone expected. Naomi watched a rescue tender break from the main transit lane and angle toward a maintenance beacon cluster. A small movement in the wide dark, the kind of movement people at tables like to control from abstract distance. "Lucan will fall," Elias said. "Yes, and the network. Not all at once. The compact will return with cleaner language." Elias stood beside her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Was it worth it?" Naomi did not answer immediately. In the last 2 days, she had been treated as a manageable delegate, an expendable negotiator, a potential embarrassment, and a useful loser. She had been asked to carry Earth into a room already set against it, and then fail with restraints so others could convert the defeat into policy and profit. She had walked in a Concord Hall smaller than the system around her, in every measurable sense that mattered to an empire. Yet Earth had not been crushed there. Not because Earth was the strongest power. It was not. Not because humans held secret force in reserve. They did not. Earth had held because one woman in a losing room had refused to let defeat be written in administrative handwriting and then called peace by a respectable name. "Yes," Naomi said at last. "It was worth it." They were interrupted by a quiet approach from behind. Auditor Turin Quill stood a few steps away with a sealed data strip in one hand. He looked as though he disliked delivering anything personal in public. "This is not an official transfer," he said. Naomi turned. "Then what is it?" "A continuity note." He handed her the strip. She glanced at the metadata. It was a chamber extract, not sensitive enough to be classified and not ordinary enough to be meaningless. "Why give this to me?" she asked. Quill looked out through the glass rather than at her. Because today the chamber discovered the difference between order and obedience. It may be useful for Earth to remember that some of us noticed. Then he left before she could answer. Naomi loaded the strip on her wrist display. It contained a short internal remark appended to the suspension summary. Not a public statement and not a headline, only a line meant for process memory. Earth did not prevail through superior leverage. Earth prevailed because compelled silence failed. Naomi read it twice. It was not praise in the human way, and it was not sentimental. It did not pretend the day had transformed the galaxy or converted enemies into friends. It simply recorded the truth with enough dignity that the record itself became a kind of respect. Later, when the station cycle dimmed and the immediate rush of damage control had moved elsewhere, Naomi returned alone to the central floor of Concord Hall. She had come back for one quiet minute before leaving Meridian Ring behind. The chamber was empty now. The tears rose around her in still arcs. The translation mesh slept, and the speaking markers were dark. Without voices, the hall seemed less like a seat of power and more like what it truly was, a machine for deciding whose version of order would be called common sense. She stood where she had answered Kalis, where she had demanded that Lucan speak plainly, where Mar had suspended the vote. She thought of Earth, not as a symbol and not as an idea debated by the galaxy. She thought of freight workers, station medics, pilots, dock families, exhausted administrators, stubborn ship captains, and civilians whose survival often depended on whether distant people with polished words chose speed over leverage for one critical hour. Those were the people hidden under phrases like burden harmonization, transit discipline, and continuity management. Those were the people Lucan had been prepared to trade into dependence. Naomi put one hand on the nearest table edge. A story had shifted today, and that mattered. But she was too experienced to mistake a shift for safety. The compact would return. Another draft would come. Other powers would test softer routes to the same outcome. On Earth, Lucan's removal would satisfy some, but not all. Networks of appetite did not disappear because one face was exposed. They changed names, learned caution, and waited for a less watchful room. Humanity's position in the wider order had not become easy. It had become visible, and visibility, Naomi knew, was both shield and risk. Her display pulsed with an incoming message from Earth's interim coordination desk. Formal language, temporary thanks, notice of internal inquiry, and a request for secure debrief upon return. She let it wait. For 1 minute longer, she remained in the empty hall and listened to the silence that followed a broken design. It was not a heroic silence and not clean victory. It was the silence of a machine interrupted before it could complete the shape it had been built to produce. That was enough for one day. When Naomi finally left Concord Hall, Meridian Ring was still awake around her. Freight lanes glowed beyond the station arcs, and civilian carriers continued their crossings. Somewhere far below, a rescue tender cleared a maintenance stack and entered open corridor under lawful urgency no one had yet managed to price out of existence. The next struggle would come. She knew that. The system would adapt. She knew that too. But it would adapt having failed to make Earth kneel quietly. Vote suspended did not mean final victory. Earth had not won the wider fight. But Earth had not been forced to bow in that chamber. And Naomi had stopped a defeat that had been carefully arranged in advance. And their defeats, great powers remember more bitterly than open rebellion. They remember the moment a smaller voice refuses to be arranged. They remember the instant a chamber built to manage outcomes must stop and hear what it meant to bury. They remember when dignity survives the paperwork. Naomi Vale walked toward the outbound transit spine with her shoulders aching and her mind already moving through the next fights before she had even left the old one. Around her, station personnel moved with the practiced indifference of people who lived near history and still had freight schedules to keep. No music followed her. No ceremonial escort appeared. No grand public applause rose from the ring. That, too, felt right. The day had not belonged to spectacle. It had belonged to refusal. And in the long balance between Earth and the systems that preferred Earth-compliant, refusal was sometimes the most expensive language a human being could afford to speak. Naomi spoke it. Anyway, that was why Meridian Ring had failed to break her. That was why the chamber had stopped. That was why, for all the pressure stacked above and around her, humanity had not left Concord Hall smaller than it entered. It had left marked, watched, and still contested, but not smaller. And for the powers that had expected a managed surrender, that was loss enough to carry home. If Naomi Vale's stand meant something to you, then maybe that is what stories like this are really for. Not just to imagine distant worlds, alien powers, and grand councils, but to remind us that dignity still matters when the room is stacked against you. Even when a system is larger, colder, and stronger, one steady voice can still force it to stop and listen. If this story stayed with you, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who loves science fiction with heart, and subscribe to the channel. Your support truly means more than you know. It helps this channel keep telling stories where humanity is tested, pushed to the edge, and still refuses to bend. Thank you for being here, for listening all the way through, and for helping this journey continue. Until the next story.